Welcome to Ruins and Haunting Heritage. My name is Dr. April Bisa. I'm an associate professor of anthropology at Vassar College, and this is my archaeology seminar for the fall 2020 semester. In the last lecture for week 4, we're going to take what might be an unexpected turn, and we're going to look at a government-issued document that is how to apply the National Register criteria for evaluating places for listing on the National Register of Historic Places list. So why have we taken this turn away from spooky stories and theory of spaces, places, and time to a government document? Well, one of the things that Michelle Hanks pointed out in her research on ghost tourism is that one of the reasons that ghost tourism is so popular is that it creates stories of history and of the past that includes everyday people. And it's important to see how the National Register criteria for the evaluation of historic places encourages a certain sort of history, a certain sort of story, and therefore you need interventions in order to make it that average everyday people can be included. I think ghost hunting and ghost tourism is one way of doing this. I also think archaeology is one way of doing this. And archaeologists are often being criticized for studying sites that are not, quote unquote, important. And I think this importance comes from the fact that only certain places are labeled important from National Register criteria. So for example, one of my past research foci, something like that, was one-room schoolhouses. And one-room schoolhouses in America are very interesting in that after one-room schools closed, mostly around the 1940s, not that long ago, but long ago that it's in this mythical time for most people today. When they closed, the buildings moved around the landscape. People were very attached to their one-room schools. They were signs of community because their mother has gone there, their father had gone there, their grandparents had gone there. It was also that communities usually built, started, and ran their own schools. So the consolidation of one-room schools into bigger, more regional schools created this sort of site that was at that margin of what is sacred versus what is very normal and everyday, right? It was right at that margin. And people didn't want those buildings demolished. So they often, if the building was going to be demolished, somebody would buy it or trade for it and move it to maybe their farm. One-room schoolhouse that I found had been turned into a corn crib to hold corn kernels after the harvest. They were turned into houses. They were turned into meeting places, churches, all sorts of different things. So a lot of those one-room schools can't get listed on the National Register of Historic Places because their level of importance was local. They're a local important story because the very next town over had their own schoolhouse that they were connected to. And the National Register criteria is very explicit about what they call redundant resources. That if there are a lot of something, then none of them get listed, right? So the thing that they mentioned specifically in the National Register criteria is historic churches. Every religious community thinks that their church is very significant and has a very interesting history, and therefore they want their church listed on the National Register. But the register is national. It's about the nation and the story of the nation. So the National Register is very nationalistic in that way. So various readings that we have done so far talk about how archaeology and studies of the paranormal and ghosts and so forth intersect with the idea of who we are as people that comes back to this national story, which comes back to colonial stories, which are often national stories, which comes back to the sense of shared identity. So in the National Register criteria, and as a government document, it's not super exciting to read, straight through. It's much more interesting if you hunt and find what you're looking for. But on page 2 of the National Register criteria is the criteria for evaluations and the criteria considerations. So here it says that the quality of significance in American history, architecture, archaeology, engineering, and culture is present in districts, sites, buildings, structures, and objects that possess integrity of location, design, setting, materials, workmanship, feeling, and association. So it very much includes architecture and archaeology. It very much includes the idea that places, locations, landscapes, but it also has feeling, which is more of this phenomenology that we've been studying. So it goes on to have some bullet points. So it has to possess this stuff: integrity of location, design, setting, materials, workmanship, feeling, and association. And then there's 4 bullet items, A, B, C, and D. So to be listed on the National Register, it also has to be associated with events that have made a significant contribution to the broad patterns of our history. So a local murder, a local Good Samaritan, none of those people, their histories aren't going to get into the National Register unless it's part of this broader pattern. B is that are associated with the lives of persons significant in our past, and they even italicized significant in our past. So this is of the national level. So this is why any place that has George Washington that slept there can potentially be listed on the National Register, but for any place that other people have slept, it's not important at all. So this is, again, that propagation of this national story that certain people are more important than other people. C is that embody the distinctive characteristics of a type, period, or method of construction. So this is like of the colonial style or of the Federalist style, which is a style of architecture. Or that represent the work of a master. So if it is a master architect, then it gets listed on there. Or that possess high artistic values, or that present a significant and distinguishable entity whose components may lack individual distinction. So it has to be distinctive. So therefore, one-room schoolhouses, which were almost always made following one of a series of patterns that were approved, is never going to be distinctive enough to be on the register. If somebody did build a schoolhouse that was completely different, it might be distinctive enough to be on the register, but only if it's associated with some reason that it was built that way. And bullet point D is that have yielded or may be likely to yield information important in prehistory or history. So this D is where most archaeology sites are able to intervene into the National Register criteria. That we can say as archaeologists that this place that was demolished, so in a previous lecture I talked about Orson Fowler's Octagon House, and that he created and instigated a movement in the mid-1800s for octagon houses that were supposed to be a better way for society to be organized, and lots of mathematicians built octagon houses. So that is a distinctive type, criteria C. It's B, it's associated with the lives of a person that may be considered significant in the past, right? He had a lot of downfall with some of the things that he was talking about after his octagon house, so maybe not. And then A, associated with events that have made significant contributions to broad patterns of our history. To me, the Fowler octagon houses are kind of like the Prius car, that they represented a different way of trying to be more equitable in how we organize our lives, but that only certain people bought into it, and then it fell from popularity. So there isn't a lot here for an Orson Squire Fowler octagon house to be listed, but then when you get to D, it says anything that may yield or may likely be yield information important in prehistory or history. I believe we have the site of the original Fowler octagon house that was blown up by dynamite by the county and the city of Poughkeepsie because people were getting sick in it. Whether people were getting sick in it because of the house or because it had become a boarding house and was hosting people who were more transient is the reason. So I think there's interesting stuff to be said there, but we could say that the archaeology site should be listed on the National Register or is eligible for listing, right? We could consider it eligible without actually listing it, because by doing the archaeology, we could learn more about this time and this person and this movement and the association of architecture with human health and human society improving, right? So this is how archaeologists can use the National Register to try to intervene into what is the nationalistic story that is very focused on presidents and soldiers and politicians and not other people. So it goes on page 2 to have criteria considerations. It says, ordinarily, cemeteries, birthplaces, or graves of historical figures, properties owned by religious institutions or used for religious purposes, structures that have been moved from their original locations, reconstructed historic buildings, or properties primarily commemorative in nature and properties that achieve significance within the past 50 years shall not be considered eligible for the National Register. So again, cemeteries are a redundant resource. So therefore, cemeteries are not ordinarily considered eligible for a National Register. It says birthplaces or graves of historical figures also not eligible. Part of this is that birthplaces of historical figures and graves of historical figures gives every historical figure 2 additional sites in addition to probably where they lived, where they worked, the battle they fought. So they start to become redundant resources. But they have the word ordinarily. So if there's nothing else associated with a significant person except their grave, then their grave might be considered. Anything that has been changed significantly from its time period of significance. So if you renovate your house, it might not be eligible for listing on the National Register. And it also has to be at least 50 years old. So because of the time that it takes to do the paperwork and evaluation, usually anything that's at least 45 years old can be considered, because it'll take probably 5 years for the work to be done. Then it goes on to say, however, such properties will qualify if they are integral parts of districts. So a historic district is a cluster of an area. So this is a landscape instead of a place. So if properties are integral parts of a landscape, that landscape is considered important, then they might be eligible. Or if they fall within the following categories. So then it has a bunch of different things. I'm not going to enumerate them all. But D includes a cemetery, which derives its primary significance from graves of persons of transcendent importance, from age, from distinctive design features, or from association with historic events. So if the cemetery contains many people associated with one historic event, then it might be considered eligible. So thinking about how there are these rules that the United States government has put on their national heritage, and then there is this desire for people to see themselves and people like them in the past, and how ghost stories, ghost tourism, ghost hunting, and archaeology all fit in between the national story and the everyday lives of people. So then this bulletin goes on to give you the actual instructions on how you would figure out if something is worthy of listing on the National Register. So we're going to switch on over to a actual site, an actual landscape, which includes a cemetery, for you to consider how things get listed without just trying to memorize some abstract terminology, right? So this is where we get into the discussion I was having about archaeologists needing to tell good stories instead of just load technical information to people. So on page 9, it has local historic context. A local historic context represents any aspect of the history of a town, city, county, cultural area, or region. It is defined by the importance of the property, not necessarily the physical location of the property. For instance, if a property is of a type found throughout a state, or its boundaries extend over 2 states, but its importance relates only to a particular county, the property should be considered of local significance. The level of context of archaeological sites significant for the information potential depends on the scope of the applicable research design. And then it gives an example from prehistory. So this local historical context may be important for the site that we're going to discuss. So we're going to discuss the Briar Hill Cemetery, which is part of the Duchess County Poorhouse and Lunatic Asylum, and it was also a pauper burial ground. So it wasn't restricted, the cemetery wasn't restricted to the people who were in the poorhouse or lunatic asylum. Anybody who died that could not afford a burial in a regular cemetery or a for-profit cemetery or a church cemetery, or didn't have loved ones to claim their bodies, could wind up in this cemetery. So I'm going to provide you a link with just a brief story map. This is a more geographical way of explaining and exploring a place that will show you a little bit about the cemetery. I'm not going to go a lot into the history of the poorhouse and lunatic asylum for one of the reasons is that they were redundant resources. Every county at one point had a poorhouse or a lunatic asylum, and therefore they become redundant. In Duchess County, we had a poorhouse in the city of Poughkeepsie, in addition to the poorhouse in the county. So doubly redundant, right? So these places are all over. So when is a poorhouse a National Register eligible place? Well, you have to find something significant that happened there. And for the most part, a lot of what happened at poorhouses and lunatic asylums has been kept quiet because there was lots of scandal, and that's one of the reasons that they were shut down. The poorhouse on the other side of the river from Poughkeepsie, in the Ulster County Poorhouse near New Paltz, there was a lot of unhappiness in the community about how much it cost to keep poor people in the poorhouse, to feed them, even though most poorhouses had their own farm system, so that the people in the poorhouse who were capable of would tend to plants and animals that were supposed to be the primary source of food, so that it was a self-contained entity, and therefore it didn't require a lot of extra cash, but it also was teaching people in the poorhouse how to work a farm. Lots of times the women would do sewing. Sometimes people would be essentially lent out to neighboring houses to do chores and things. So the poorhouse wasn't supposed to be a burden on the community. It was supposed to be a place that poor people could go to learn trades, to have shelter, and that they were intended to leave at some point in time. But there also was a lot of stigma about being somebody who went to a poorhouse, and therefore there was a lot of anonymity that needed to happen. So this poorhouse, the Duchess County poorhouse, and many poorhouses have cemeteries. And these cemeteries do not have names on the grave markers because nobody wanted people to know that their family was in this cemetery. So that also makes it harder to do the history of these places because of privacy laws, and because it's just, you have to connect dots with information that is hard to get access to. So this is one of the ways that archaeology can intervene, in that we have been helping to mark with a map system where the markers are currently now, compare those markers to a previous survey from the 1930s, figure out where markers should be that have disappeared. These markers were not intended to last forever, and a lot of them are just eroding. They're just breaking and crumbling. Some of that has to do with lawn maintenance. Some of that has to do with visitors. Some of that has to do with a tree adjacent to a marker pushes up that marker and the marker falls away. They're round in this cemetery, so they roll down the hill. So we're basically, as archaeologists, using the material culture of grave markers and the techniques of mapping to preserve the locations when nothing else will be preserving the locations. We are not excavating graves at all. But when we can find the stories of the people who were buried there and the spot that they were buried in, we try to capture that information. So on this story map, there is some pictures and information at the top. And as you scroll down, it shows the markers and it shows the layout of the cemetery, including graves that we only know through ground penetrating radar, which is an archaeology technique. The person who did the ground penetrating radar was a Vassar professor who was in the geology department, so he wasn't actually an archaeologist who did it. But you could see from the different types of markers that we detected 534 graves that had no markers. There were, at this point of the survey, 300 markers that were there. So there's 850 people around that are certainly buried in this cemetery. So we also include a newspaper clipping about a baby who is buried in this cemetery, and the babies seem to be near each other. There's also one person in this cemetery, Lewis B. Hubble, who does have an actual grave marker, and that's because that after he died, his sister found out that he was buried in this cemetery, and he only had a number, and she didn't like that, so she paid to have a stone made and placed where he is buried. So at the bottom of the website is an interactive map that has the dots that are the markers or where the markers should be, and you could click on them and find out information if we know the name of the person, where they might be from, why they might have been there. There's some people who were found dead on railroad tracks, dead in the river, all sorts of different type of people in this cemetery. So using that site to think about, well, for this local context, right? A local historical context represents an aspect of the history of a town, city, cultural area, and is defined by the importance of the property, not necessarily the physical location. So this property, specifically this cemetery, is it important? Does it have a local historical context? Does it represent an aspect of the history of a town? So in some ways it represents the aspect of the history of the town in that people cared for people who were poor by making sure that there was this place. But it also shows that the caring for these people ended at some time, that most people don't know that this cemetery exists. And until recently, with a new director of public works, it just became open to the public and restored to the point where people could go to it and walk around. When I first went there, it was literally in the woods. There was poison ivy and briars everywhere. It's called the Briar Hill Cemetery, so lots of briars. And it was almost impossible to find anything or make any sense of anything. So thinking through this National Register criteria for a place like that. So in the larger criteria, there's A, B, C, and D. So criteria A is it associated with an event? This poorhouse cemetery is not associated with any specific event, so we could skip over that. But a lot of ghost stories are associated with events such as murders, such as plagues, such as people who died who weren't at a stage in their life where we expected them to die. So for those, we could go back and look at that event criteria and see where the National Register is skewed towards and where maybe there is an opening for archaeology. Criteria B is it associated with a specific person? There's no person of national significance that this cemetery includes or was created by, so we could skip over that one. The next is design and construction, which these are just circular markers in a field, so not that one. The next one is information potential. As I said before, this is the one that archaeology usually falls under. So now it's on us as archaeologists to find the stories that we could use to compel National Register criteria protections to this site. So when sites are listed on the National Register, it's not that they can't be demolished, but it is that if the government is going to do something that requires damage or demolition to a National Register property, it has to be considered. It has to be thought through first. So if somebody wanted to build, say, a subdivision on this property and say that they're just going to take away the 900 people that are buried there, if it's not listed on the National Register, it's easier to do that. If it is listed on the National Register, they have to explain why they're going to do that. And then they have to ensure that the bodies are treated in a way that is dictated usually by the State Historic Preservation Office. So criteria D says, well, the property has to have information to contribute to our understanding of human history or prehistory, and the information must be considered important. To who, right? How are we going to figure out this importance? So this is where we could look through these stories and see how it relates to what's going on today in the present. We could talk about bias, we could talk about economics, we could talk about prosperity using these people's stories. So they give us an example of something that is eligible under criteria D and not eligible under criteria D. So something eligible under criteria D includes a building exhibiting a local variation on a standard design or a construction technique can be eligible if a study could yield important information, such as how local availability of materials or construction expertise affected the evolution of local building development. Right? So if we could find evidence within this cemetery that it represents how the local community changed over time, right? It's of community or local importance, then it might be eligible. Not eligible includes their example, the ruins of a hacienda once contained murals that have since been destroyed. Historical documentation, however, indicates that the murals were significant for their highly unusual design. The ruins cannot be eligible under criterion D for the importance of the destroyed murals if the information is contained only in the documentation. So any ruin might be eligible if the ruin contains information that is not otherwise available. And that's where archaeology comes in. So thinking through National Register criteria, thinking through what makes it into our history books, what makes it into our national site tours and our national historic registers versus all of the other history out there that is largely ignored and has to be done by people who are outside of the dominant fields of history. So this could include archaeologists and it could include ghost tours. So previous week, week 3, my class took the elements of my Vassar ghost tours that I created by researching the archives. And for each stop along the campus, My students are going to read the stories that are a combination of history and phenomenology. And we're going to talk and discuss about how that might change their sense of the place that they live and call home, their college campus. If that has importance, if that has power, then ghost tours are conveying local history, local historic context. So on what scale can a local tour of places like the Duchess County Pauper Cemetery convey to people a better sense of the history of the community that they live in? That is a history populated by people who had economic struggles, who had problems with career continuity, who had the problems of everyday people, instead of our local history being about politicians, about soldiers, about battles fought long ago that have very little relevance to today, as something like socioeconomic precarity does.